Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 53, The Track. Mr. Bucket and his fat forefinger are much in consultation together under the existing circumstances. When Mr. Bucket has a matter of this pressing interest under his consideration, the fat forefinger seems to rise to the dignity of a familiar demon. He puts it to his ears, and it whispers information. He puts it to his lips, and it enjoins him in secrecy. He rubs it over his nose, and it sharpens his scent. He shakes it before a guilty man, and it charms him to his destruction. Otherwise mildly studious in his observation of human nature, on the whole, a benignant philosopher, not disposed to be severe upon the follies of mankind, Mr. Bucket pervades a vast number of houses, and strolls about an infinity of streets, to outward appearances rather languishing for want of an object. He is, in the friendliest condition toward his species, and will drink with most of them. He is free with his money, affable in his manners, innocent in his conversation, but through the placid stream of his life there glides an undercurrent of forefinger. Time and place cannot bind Mr. Bucket. Like man in the abstract, he is here today and gone tomorrow, but very unlike man indeed. He is here again the next day. This evening, he will be casually looking into the iron extinguishers at the doors of Sir Leicester Dedlock's house in town, and tomorrow morning he will be walking in the leads at Chesney Wold, where erst the old man walked, whose ghost is propitiated with 100 guineas. Drawers, desks, pockets, all things belonging to him, Mr. Bucket examines. A few hours afterwards, he and the Roman will be alone together, comparing forefingers. It is likely that these occupations are irreconcilable with home enjoyment, but it is certain that Mr. Bucket at present does not go home. Though in general he highly appreciates the society of Mrs. Bucket, he holds himself aloof from that dear solace. Mrs. Bucket is dependent on their lodger, fortunately an amiable lady in whom she takes an interest, for companionship and conversation. A great crowd assembles in Lincoln's Inn Fields on the day of the funeral. Sir Leicester Dedlock attends the ceremony in person. The amount of inconsolable carriages is immense. The peerage contributes more four-wheeled affliction than has ever been seen in that neighborhood. Quiet among the undertakers and the equipages, and the calves of so many legs, all steeped in grief. Mr. Bucket sits concealed in one of the inconsolable carriages, and at his ease surveys the crowd through the lattice blinds. He has a keen eye, and nothing escapes him. "And there you are, my partner, eh?" apostrophizing Mrs. Bucket, stationed on the steps of the deceased's house. The procession has not started yet, but is waiting for the cause of its assemblage to be brought out. Mr. Bucket, in the foremost emblazoned carriage, uses his two fat forefingers to hold the lattice a hair's breadth open while he looks. And it says a great deal for his attachment as a husband that he is still occupied with Mrs. B. "There you are, my partner, eh?" he murmuringly reports. "And our lodger with you? I'm taking notice of you, Mrs. Bucket." Mr. Bucket sits with the most attentive eyes until the sacked depository of noble secrets is brought down. Where are all these secrets now? Does he keep them yet? Did they fly with him on that sudden journey? And until the procession moves and Mr. Bucket's view is changed, after which he composes himself for an easy ride, and takes note of the fittings of the carriage in case he should ever find such knowledge useful, Mr. Bucket sits out the procession in his own easy manner, and glides from the carriage when the opportunity he has settled with himself arrives. He makes for Sir Leicester Dedlock, which is at present a sort of home to him, where he comes and goes as he likes at all hours, where he is always welcome and made much of, and walks in an atmosphere of mysterious greatness. No knocking or ringing for Mr. Bucket. He has caused himself to be provided with a key, and can pass in at his pleasure. As he is crossing the hall, Mercury informs him Here's another letter for you, Mr. Bucket, come by post, and gives it him. Now, although Mr. Bucket walks upstairs to the little library within the larger one, with the face of a man who receives some score of letters every day, it happens that much correspondence is not incidental in his life. He is no great scribe, and discourages correspondence with himself and others, as being too artless and direct a way of doing delicate business. Further, he often sees damaging letters produced in evidence, and has occasion to reflect that it is a green thing to write them. For these reasons, he has very little to do with letters, either as sender or receiver, and yet he has received around half-dozen within the last 24 hours. And this, says Mr. Bucket, spreading it out on the table, is in the same hand and consists of the same 2 words. What 2 words? He turns the key in the door, ungirdles his black pocketbook, book of fate to many, lays another letter by it, and reads, boldly written in each, Lady Dedlock. Yes, says Mr. Bucket, but I could have made the money without this anonymous information. Having put the letters in his book of fate and girdled it up again, he unlocks the door just in time to admit his dinner, which is brought upon a goodly tray with a decanter of sherry. Mr. Bucket frequently observes in friendly circles, where there is no restraint, that he likes a toothful of your fine old brown East Inder sherry better than anything you can offer him. Consequently, he fills and empties his glass with a smack of his lips, and is proceeding with his refreshment when an idea enters his mind. Mr. Bucket softly opens the door of communication between that room and the next, and looks in. The library is deserted, and the fire is sinking low. Mr. Bucket's eye, after taking pigeon flight round the room, alights upon a table where letters are usually put as they arrive. Several letters for Sir Leicester are upon it. Mr. Bucket draws near and examines the directions. No, he says, there's none in that hand. It's only me as is written to. I can break it to Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, tomorrow. With that, he returns to finish his dinner with a good appetite, and after a light nap is summoned into the drawing-room. Sir Leicester has received him there these several evenings past. Have you anything new to communicate, officer? Inquires Sir Leicester. My time is wholly at your disposal, with a view to the vindication of the outraged mystery of the law, with the outraged majesty of the law. If I have not, pursues Sir Leicester, in the most emphatic manner adjured you, officer, to exercise your utmost skill in this atrocious case, I particularly desire to take the present opportunity of rectifying any omission I may have made. Let no expense be a consideration. I am prepared to defray all charges. You can incur none in pursuit of the object you have undertaken that I shall hesitate for a moment to bear. My mind, Sir Leicester adds with a generous warmth, has not, as many be easily supposed, recovered its tone since the late diabolical occurrence. It is not likely ever to recover its tone, but it is full of indignation tonight, after undergoing the ordeal of consigning to tomb the remains of a faithful, zealous, a devoted adherent. Sir Leicester's voice trembles, and his grey hair stirs upon his head. Tears are in his eyes. The best part of his nature is aroused. I declare, he says, I solemnly declare that until this crime is discovered, and in the course of justice punished, I almost feel as if there were a stain upon my name. A gentleman who has devoted a large portion of his life to me, a gentleman who has devoted the last day of his life to me, a gentleman who has constantly sat at my table and slept under my roof, goes from my house to his own, and is struck down within an hour of his leaving my house. I cannot say but that he may have been followed from my house, watched at my house, even first marked because of his association with my house, which may have suggested his possessing greater wealth, and being altogether of greater importance than his own retiring demeanour would have indicated. If I cannot, with my means and influence and my position, bring all the perpetrators of such a crime to light, I fail in the assertion of my respect for that gentleman's memory, and of my fidelity toward one who was ever faithful to me. while he makes this protestation with great emotion and earnestness, looking round the room as if he were addressing an assembly. Mr. Bucket glances at him with an observant gravity in which there might be, but for the audacity of the thought, a touch of compassion. "The ceremony of today," continues Sir Leicester, "strikingly illustrative of the respect in which my deceased friend," he lays a stress upon the word, for death levels all distinctions, "was held by the flower of the land, has, I say, aggravated the shock I have received from this most horrible and audacious crime. If it were my brother who had committed it, I would not spare him." Mr. Bucket says, "Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet, I look upon the case as pretty well complete. It is a beautiful case, and what little is wanting to complete it I expect to be able to supply in a few hours." "I am very glad indeed to hear it," says Sir Leicester, "highly creditable of you. "Sir Leicester Dedlock, Baronet," returns Mr. Bucket very seriously, "I hope it may, at one and the same time, do me credit and prove satisfactory to all. When I depict it as a beautiful case, I mean from my point of view. As considered from other points of view, such cases will always involve more or less unpleasantness. Very strange things come to our knowledge in families, aye, and even in genteel families, in high families, in great families," says Mr. Bucket. "I have had the honour of being employed in high families before, and you have an idea," Sir Leicester, deeming it time to dismiss the officer, here majestically interposes, "Very good, thank you," and also with a wave of his hand, implying not only that there is an end of the discourse, but that if high families fall into low habits, they must take the consequences. "You will not forget, officer," he adds with condescension, "that I am at your disposal when you please." Mr. Bucket inquires if tomorrow morning now would suit, in case he should be forward as he expects to be. Sir Leicester replies, "All times are alike to me." Mr. Bucket bows. In his fondness for society and his adaptability to all grades, Mr. Bucket is presently standing before the hall fire, bright and warm on the early morning light, admiring Mercury. "Why, you're 6'2", I suppose," says Mr. Bucket. "3", says Mercury. Are you so much? But then, you see, you're broad in proportion and don't look it. You're not one of the weak-legged ones, you ain't. Was you ever modelled now?" Mr. Bucket asks. Mercury never was modelled. "And you ought to be, you know," says Mr. Bucket. "As a friend of mine, that you'll hear of one day, as a Royal Academy sculptor would stand something handsome to make a drawing of your proportions for the marble. My lady's out, ain't she?" "Out to dinner." "Goes out pretty well every day, don't she?" "Yes." "Not to be wondered at," says Mr. Bucket. "Such a fine woman as her, so handsome and so graceful and so elegant, is like a fresh lemon on a dinner table, ornamental wherever she goes. Was your father in the same way of life as yourself?" Answer in the negative. "Mine was," says Mr. Bucket. "My father was first a page, then a footman, then a butler, then a steward, then an innkeeper. Lived universally respected and died lamented. Said with his last breath that he considered service the most honourable part of his career, and so it was. I've a brother in service, and a brother-in-law. My lady a good temper?" Mercury replies, "As good as you can expect." "Ah," says Mr. Bucket, "a little spoilt, a little capricious. Lord, what can you anticipate when they're so handsome as that? And we like 'em all the better for it, don't we?" Mercury, with his hands in his pockets and his bright peach-blossom small clothes, stretches his symmetrical silk legs with an air of a man of gallantry, and can't deny it. Come the roll of wheels and a violent ringing of the bell. "Talk of angels," says Mr. Bucket, "here she is." The doors are thrown open, and she passes through the hall. Still very pale, she is dressed in slight mourning and wears 2 beautiful bracelets. Either their beauty or the beauty of her arms is particularly attractive to Mr. Bucket. He looks at them with an eager eye and rattles something in his pocket. Halfpence, perhaps. Noticing him in the distance, she turns an inquiring look on the other Mercury, who has brought her home. "Mr. Bucket, my lady." Mr. Bucket makes a leg and comes forward, passing his familiar demon over the region of his mouth. Are you wanting to see Mr. Leicester?" "No, my lady, I've seen him." Have you made any new discoveries? A few, my lady. This is merely in passing. She scarcely makes a stop and sweeps upstairs alone. Mr. Bucket, moving toward the staircase front, watches her as she goes up the steps. The old man came down to his grave, past murderous groups of statuary, repeated with their shadowy weapons on the wall out of view. She is a lovely woman, too. She really is, says Mr. Bucket, coming back to Mercury. Don't look quite healthy, though. It is not quite healthy, Mercury informs him. Suffers much from headaches. Really? That's a pity. Walking, Mr. Bucket would recommend for that. Well, she tries walking, Mercury replies. Walks sometimes for 2 hours, when she has them bad. By night, too. Are you sure you're quite so much as 6'3"? Asked Mr. Bucket, begging your pardon for interrupting you a moment. No doubt about it. Well, you're so well put together, I shouldn't have thought it. Walks by night, does she? When it's moonlight, though? Oh, yes, when it's moonlight, of course. Conversational and acquiescent on both sides. And I suppose you ain't in the habit of walking yourself, says Mr. Bucket. Not much time for it, I should say. Besides which, Mercury don't like it. Prefers carriage exercise, to be sure. To be sure, says Mr. Bucket. That makes a difference. Now I think of it, says Mr. Bucket, warming his hands and looking pleasantly at the blaze. She went out walking the very night of this business. To be sure she did. I let her into the garden over the way, and left her there. Certainly you did. I saw you doing it. I didn't see you, says Mercury. I was rather in a hurry, returns Mr. Bucket, for I was going to visit an aunt of mine that lives at Chelsea. Yes, I chanced to be passing at the time. Let's see, what time might it be? It wasn't 10, 9:30. You're right, so it was. And if I don't deceive myself, my lady was muffled in a loose black mantle with a deep fringe to it. Of course she was. Mr. Bucket must return to a little work he has to get on with upstairs, but he must shake hands with Mercury in acknowledgement of his agreeable conversation. And that is the end of chapter 53.